Hello, everybody. My name is Alexandra Vacru. I'm the Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. And I'm not sure what the right feelings are to express today as we commemorate 1 year of Russia's war against Ukraine. The loss of life and of livelihood in Ukraine is tragic and seems unlikely to end soon. As a university, we can draw attention to what's happening and try to explain it. And I could not ask for better panelists in our efforts to do that. I'm honored to have two leading thinkers on the war with me today. And let me start by introducing them. Dr. Volodymyr Dubovik is Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations at Odessa Mechnikov National University in Ukraine. He's also the director of the university's Center for International Studies. Volodymyr has conducted research at the Kennan Institute, part of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Center for International and Security Studies at the University of Maryland, and has twice been a Fulbright Scholar. He's currently visiting professor at the Russia and Eurasia program at the Fletcher School of Tufts University. He previously taught at the University of Washington in Seattle in 2013 and at St. Edward's University, University of Texas, Austin in 2016-2017. He's the co-author of Ukraine and European Security and has published many articles on US-Ukraine relations, regional and international security, and on Ukraine's foreign policy. His expertise lies in international security studies and foreign policy analysis, with a regional focus on the Black Sea, as well as US-Ukraine and transatlantic relations. Dr. Yevgenia Albats is a Russian investigative journalist, political scientist, author, and radio host. She's currently the Distinguished Journalist in Residence at NYU's Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia. She's been political editor and then was and is the editor-in-chief and CEO of The New Times, a Moscow-based Russian-language independent political weekly, since 2017. On February 28th of last year, Vladimir Putin blocked The New Times website just days after the war started. Despite that, Albats continues to run newtimes.ru, and she kept reporting from Russia until she had to leave the country in dramatic order in the last week of August 2022, after she was fined for her coverage of the war against Ukraine and pronounced a foreign agent. Since 2004, Albats had hosted Absolute Albats. This was a talk show on Echo Moskvy, which was the only remaining liberal radio station in Russia until it was taken off the air a week after the war began. Albats moved her talk show to YouTube channel that now has over 100,000 subscribers. Albats is the author of 4 books, including a prescient one on the long shadow of the KGB on Russian politics today. She was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University in 1993 and earned a PhD in government from Harvard in 2004. I have many questions to ask you both, of course, but before we start, I'd like to ask if you have a few words you'd like to say about what you're thinking about today. Volodymyr, let me start with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for inviting to speak at this event. There are many events today, but the one organized by Davis Center at Harvard University stands out, obviously, because of the high reputation of this organization. So it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be speaking at this event today. It's a commemorative event. It's really mixed feelings. On one hand, we're still there. Whatever Mr. Putin been saying before and still saying that there is no such thing as Ukraine, Ukrainian people, Ukrainian state. Well, there is. He has to deal with this, and we're not going anywhere. As we have seen already, Ukrainians offered very serious and solid resistance and have shown some resilience over this year. And it's a very hard war, obviously, on all of us. Don't get me wrong. It's basically a collective PTSD for about 40 million people, and everyone is processing this in their own way. So it's not easy, obviously, for all of us. But at the same time, we're not going to go anywhere. We're not going to capitulate. We're going to surrender. Currently, Russia controls about 17% of Ukrainian territory. That's way too much for our taste, for my taste personally. But also at the same time, it means that 83% is under control of the Ukrainian government. Right now, it doesn't look like Putin has the puzzles in place, and the levers and the tools to actually increase his left grant or strengthen his position vis-a-vis Ukraine. And then, therefore, it's a bittersweet memory and anniversary. One is that we have survived, we got through it. Some didn't, and we're going to be eternally mourning those. But some did, and many of us did, and we're doing what we can. The government is there. President Zelensky didn't go anywhere when he was offered to be evacuated. The government is working even better than before February 24th, in my opinion. We are not a failed state, and because some people thought like, oh, maybe Ukraine would be just like in Afghanistan, but it's something contrary to that. It's diametrically opposite to the failed state. It's actually a very resilient, vibrant state. We still have vibrant civil society. We still have people talking about reforms and fighting corruption because those issues are still there. Even during this existential, terrible, or horrific war, people still talk about other things as well in their lives. And everyone's trying to contribute, like people like myself, university professors. We've done that. We've been teaching for this entire year, last year, online. I did 2 courses in the spring. I did 2 courses in the fall, and I'm teaching now here at Tufts University in Massachusetts. Right now, I'm teaching a course on Ukraine security and foreign policy. I have excellent American students in my class. So, on the other hand, of course, it's a great loss that we have seen and experienced, and they didn't have to be happening. I mean, this war is completely fabricated. It's been running on a falsified pretext. None of it makes sense. I just remember this well-known saying among us that the 2 people would talk to each other, and one says, "I can't understand," but another says, "But I will explain to you." So the first one says, "I can explain, but I just can't understand." So that's what it is. Like, how is it possible even? That's why a lot of Ukrainians were not quite ready for this massive invasion back a year ago, because people just didn't think this is possible. This madness, this huge scale invasion, is it even possible in our times and days, being in 2022? But apparently it is. We can remind Mr. Putin as much as you like that this is not how you resolve conflicts with your neighbors and so on in the 21st century. But he would say, yeah, but that's how we do it. Okay, we're fine with it. So we can use the hard power that we have because nothing else is left there. Because he's been trying to address situation with Ukraine and get Ukraine subjugated by other means for years, mostly by soft power. He failed. So in 2014, he decided to do, hybrid way, some soft power, some hard power. Didn't work. So back in 2022, apparently he decided, the only thing is left is this tanks and airplanes and soldiers. Otherwise, I'm going to see Ukraine slipping away from our sphere of control, from our sphere of privileged interests. And that's going to be not acceptable to a person like Putin, because whatever project Russia he's been building for 20 plus years now, Ukraine is critical. It's a key pivotal element of it. Is it a new empire? Is it a great power? What is it? Historically, we may remember that when Russia grabbed part of Ukraine in the second half of 17th century, that's exactly when it stopped calling itself Moscow state and became a Russian empire. So there's no accidents there. There's no coincidence. Ukraine is very important to Russia. Therefore, they're going to use whatever they have at their disposal to keep Ukraine on the short leash, destroy Ukraine. If Ukraine is still not quite obeying, being subordinated, then destroy Ukraine, make it miserable, make it poor, so for no one else would be able to help it and so on. So I guess that's a lesson of the last year. It's a continuous struggle, it's a fight, it's a stress. At the same time, it's a triumph. It's incredible closeness with a lot of other people that I've never seen before this war in my life. It's really consolidated society. It's very coherent now. The government and the people are so close, like they've never been before. Like if you talk about Ukraine, you usually have people criticizing government, but right now, it's basically no light between them. The government is together with the people and vice versa. So that's a unique situation for Ukraine. Can we build up on this? I hope so. And we'll probably talk about this in our discussion. But for now, clearly, it's a very mixed feelings day. It's a trauma, deep trauma for all of us. God knows I have my anxieties and depressions because of this war. But at the same time, it's sweet to see that Ukraine is persevering and is still there.
Thank you, Volodymyr. I'm going to want to follow up on quite a few of those points, which we'll be able to do in the discussion. But let me ask Evgenia, do you want to say something to start?
It's up to you. I will be happy. Probably what I should say that today is an anniversary, of course, of the worst year in life of many of us, and it's also been a year with this sort of internal cry, at least for me, because I really believe that all of us who were grown-ups when Putin came into power, we, citizens of Russia, were responsible for what he's doing, and we are responsible for the suffering of millions and millions of Ukrainians. More than 8 million people lost their homes and had to go and live somewhere else, for hundreds and thousands who were killed, for more than 1,000 children who were killed during this year, for elderlies who passed away without anyone close ones around them. It is immense tragedy. It's not the first time we see it in Europe. The previous war was the war in Yugoslavia, awful civil war in Yugoslavia. However, it is the first time since World War II when one European nation started aggressive war, invaded another European nation with no pretext, no pretext whatsoever. And it is an imperial war, it's a colonial war. Putin is trying to get new lands that he doesn't need. It's all about power and oppression. First of all, I'm very ashamed that my country is doing this to Ukraine, the land of my ancestors. I feel that it's very important that Russians stop talking, oh, there is no such a thing as collective guilt. It's not about collective guilt. Collective guilt, it's in the courts. In the courts that obviously people should be judged individually. But as we people, regardless, I've never voted for Putin, and I never supported this regime. From day one, I was trying to write and argue that Putin presented a danger to the world. However, I still think that we bear responsibility for what our presidents do. It means that we failed to overcome those criminals in power, or we failed to resist the way we had to in order to overcome this awful regime.
Thank you. Well, let me ask a little bit about this this idea of how is war possible, right? That's what Volodymyr says. You know, in 2023, 2022, how is it that we can have this conflict between two European countries, apparently without pretext? Now, of course, Putin has had a changing series of pretexts. You know, it's either denazification or protection of Russian-speaking populations, or, you know, NATO made me do it. But the underlying goal seems to be Russia's assumption that it has the right to control Ukraine. It's not just like something that would be nice to have, that in fact, Ukraine doesn't exist as a separate culture and should be part of Russia. So I guess I would like to dig into a little bit this question of how did we get to this point where it appears that many Russians agree that they have a right to control Ukraine, right? And of course, this is a very broad stroke. And of course, we don't know exactly what Russians are thinking because it's impossible to do polling. But I guess I would ask first, Volodymyr, I'm sure like many Ukrainians, you had a lot of exchange with Russians for many years after, before and after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Did you sense at some point that there was a change in how Russians from Russia were thinking about Ukraine, or is it kind of an invention of the Kremlin that doesn't actually reflect reality?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mostly was dealing with people who are not your typical average Russians, and they would be knowing better than to believe Putin's propaganda. So basically, they were themselves troubled by the evolution of the Russian regime and the situation within their country with democracy and everything. Basically, one guy capturing all power in the country and using that to exploit the natural resources to his personal benefit and people around him. So that's the kind of Russians I would normally meet. So therefore, they were troubled enough and alarmed enough well before last year. In terms of why Russia really needs Ukraine, Ukraine is instrumental for any greater Russia. And if you don't want to just sit within the borders of the Russian Federation of today, well, you cannot construct, in his opinion, this greater Russia. You need more lands, and you need more sphere of influence, something like that, because when Russia was great, it did have, when Soviet Union was great, it did have a whole block of countries, basically subdued by Soviet power and so on. You have an Eastern Bloc and so on. So for Russia, it's very important, and Ukraine is basically this one part, which is to Russia is almost like us, part of us, at the same time, quite not us, because, they denigrate Ukrainians, they consider Ukrainians second-rate citizens, and you see it, and the war crimes that are committed in Ukraine, you actually see a reflection of that thinking about Ukrainians. Like you can do bad things to Ukrainians because they're subhuman. At the same time, once Brzezinski, who was late Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is of course hated by Russian leading figures in the political regime, has said a long time ago in the early 90s that if Russia is not controlling Ukraine, it actually has a chance of becoming a normal, democratic, civilized country. But if Russia controls Ukraine, it's doomed to be an empire. That's how it is. I guess they want to be an empire. They want to have Ukraine. So nothing else is so important to Russia as Ukraine. Belarus is not. Georgia is not. Kazakhstan is not. Ukraine is. Ukraine is just too important to them. So basically the whole idea of grabbing Ukraine and not maybe the entire country, maybe not, including all those lands within, into the Russian Federation, even though we now found out with the so-called annexations, he's actually interested in a very simple, basic land grab as well. So therefore, I think that he should be frustrated with his plans, no matter what, because what, if Ukrainians tomorrow, imagine for a moment, stop fighting, then he would just keep pushing. That's a trick of situation. That's a trap, really. That's a dilemma for Ukrainians. If we do a ceasefire tomorrow, or some kind of peace plan, premature, half-baked, then Putin would just use the situation, have a pause, get more troops, get more weapons, and will continue to push in. So unfortunately for us, the only real solution going forward is to deliver to Russia some sort of defeat. And of course, we can talk about what kind of defeat. I'm not talking about Ukrainian troops marching in the victory parade in Red Square in Moscow. We don't need that. We actually just need to get to the borders of our country, restore our territorial integrity. But there got to be some kind of defeat of Russia. And there got to be some weakening of Russia. And I think Secretary of Defense of the United States, Lloyd Austin, said quite eloquently and on the topic last spring when he said that our objective is weakening of Russia to the extent that it ceases to be a threat to Ukraine and other countries in the region. That's quite doable, actually, if you're persistent, if you stay in the course, if you're not hesitating, if you're keeping coherence of the big coalition of countries supporting Ukraine and punishing Russia for its aggression. And of course, Ukraine would still carry most of the burden and will have, to deal with the brunt of the situation. We'll still lose some people, both civilians and military. But the alternative is just not unthinkable for Ukraine. We don't want to be non-existent nation. We want to be existing nation with our democratic society, with our borders, with our sovereignty. And for that, we need to, just persevere, just withstand these terrible times. And we can't agree to ending this war prematurely, because it wouldn't be really an end to the war.
So I'm sure we're going to come back to questions of how the war ends, but I noticed that Evgenia was nodding her head no in disagreement. I'd like to hear what you think. Evgenia, including perhaps you could explain why it is that a country that is already so large would feel that it needs to control Ukraine as well.
Thank you very much to both of you. First of all, just to answer to the question with why I disagreed with something that Vladimir said. Any country in the close proximity to Russia, Putin sees as Russian sphere of influence.
So not just
Therefore,
Ukraine.
in that respect, it's not just Ukraine, but it is Kazakhstan, it is Kyrgyzstan, it is Tajikistan, it is Belarus, it is Moldova, and like that. And it's not just Ukraine which got under assault, but in in 1990s, first it was Moldova, and then in 2002, 2003, 2004, it was Moldova. Then in 2008, it was Georgia. For God's sake, Putin annexed 20% of their territory, of the territory of Georgia. And Russian tanks were in Gagri. And if Bush didn't bring the Fifth Fleet into the Black Sea, God knows, Putin, there were talks in Moscow that he was going to occupy Tbilisi back then in 2008. Now, we see Lukashenko managed to stay in power in 2020 when hundreds of thousands of people were on the streets in this 9 million strong nation, precisely because he had support, both financial, military, and economic support from the side of that of Putin. And Putin treats Belarus as its vassal state. And if you talk to Belarusians, they will tell you exactly what I'm telling you. That there were, for a while, there were publications in the American media, in expert journals, that Putin was going to annex Belarus. He doesn't need to annex Belarus. Lukashenko delivered him everything, including including suppression of each and any freedoms in Belarus, including suppression of opposition, including putting all political activists in jails, including denial to citizens of Belarus their right to elect their own presidents and governors. And so it goes. On contrary, Ukraine, in 2013, Ukraine showed to Russians the kind of power civil society could have. And that's what Putin couldn't stand. He couldn't stand, from my perspective, three main things in Ukraine. One, success of the revolution of dignity, and this whole notion of dignity that were presented by Ukrainians back on Nezalezhnosti Square and in Kiev. People were ready to die, and they died in Kiev defending their right for freedom. So that number one, that Putin cannot stand in Ukraine. Number two, unlike Russia, Ukraine is one of those states which we know in political science as weak states, strong societies. I'm just citing the name of the famous book on the issue. So Ukraine is extremely powerful in its civil society. It has an immense network. You know this better than I do, but I do too, because I traveled all around Ukraine a lot. And I wrote from the ground. I was writing pieces from the ground. So this is second very important thing that Putin cannot stand. He couldn't allow Russians to see that in Ukraine, those people whom Putin perceived to be less of humans, or not exactly good Russians or semi-Russians or God knows what, so that those people who were deprived by Russian czars for hundreds years the right to have their documents in Ukrainian or write in Ukrainian and to have Ukrainian literature. So those people all of a sudden told their corrupted president Yanukovych, get out of here. And he got out. and that was amazing. And I can tell you that back in Moscow, I remember 2004, and then this 2013, we were writing non-stop from Ukrainian, about Ukrainian. I was publishing one cover story about Ukraine in my New Times after another. We were back then, we were on paper. So Putin was afraid, is afraid of the example that Ukraine gives to Russians. And people need to see the possibilities. And if they see that it is possible to kick out some son of a bitch out of the office, they may try to do this. And third, your president. I think that, you know, when Vladimir Zelensky was just getting into power, there were, of course, you know, everybody in Russian propaganda media were writing that, you know, oh, he's a comic, you know, and it was sort of, you know, okay, let them play, let them, you know, in any case, you know, we will bring our own guy and, you know, Zelensky won't be able to govern. And I watched the series Servant to the People. 7 seasons. No, I didn't watch all 7. You know, I usually watch the first series and the end of the season. But I was watching this, I was thinking, wow, this guy already lived through his presidency. It is amazing experience that he got playing as an actor. And, you know, since the school of Russian drama, or the school of drama in our part of the world requires reliving the experience of a character. And Zelensky, that's exactly what happened to him. And in fact, if you recall all those 7 series, he survived through awful things. He survived through jail, through assassinations. Of course, the kind of test that he has faced now and is facing as we speak is harder than anything which was played in this movie. Still, Zelensky turned out to be just extremely good communicator, as Stephen Kotkin said in his interview to David Remnick in the New Yorker. He, you know, you wouldn't believe, but you know, when I was in Moscow, and I was in Moscow till the end of August, each evening I was listening to Zelensky. And you know, I remember, you know, the first days of the war, I was in the hospital. I'm crying. You know, it was something. You know, world came to an end, and I remember all of a sudden, you know, somebody sent me a link, and we see Zelensky with very low voice on Bankova, and all of us we know Bankova, of course. You know, in my part of the world, we know Bankova. It's a government street in Kiev. And he's looking into doing selfie. And he was saying, President is here in Ukraine. President is here. Prime Minister is here. Speaker of the Parliament is here. And it was so inspiring, you know? And Putin knows how many of us Russians do or have been listening to Zelensky's speeches in these late evenings during this last year, and he doesn't understand. Zelensky gave Russians an image of the kind of a leader they would like to have. Let me stop here.
Okay, we're covering everything in every single answer, which is great, but then I need to double back a little bit, and I want to go back to the question upon which you were shaking your head, Evgenia, which is the idea that Russia has an imperial attitude to all of these countries around it in Central Asia and the Caucasus. It's not just Ukraine. And I wanted to put the question back to you, Volodymyr, since you are also a foreign policy specialist, which is the general understanding is that Russia feels it has the right to control these countries in its sphere of influence, so the former Soviet states and before that parts of the empire. And if it can do it through soft means like controlling the politicians, for example, or making sure that the pro-Moscow politicians win or corrupting some of the officials, that's ideal because it's kind of efficient. But if not, he's willing to use military force. And that's what he showed Georgia in 2008. That's what he's showing Ukraine. And there's a lot of talk right now in Western political science about kind of this suddenly realizing that Russia and the Soviet imperial attitude towards this space has not changed. And there are lots of calls to decolonize, you know, Russian and Eurasian studies, for example. And I guess I would ask, you know, knowing what you know about the relationship between Russia and some of these countries, and Now these countries know exactly what Russia is willing to do to control them. Yet we see earlier this week that most of those countries abstained from voting in the United Nations against Russia's invasion. Right? How do you explain the fact that there are still many of these countries that are going to play along with Moscow, even though they know that it's dangerous, and even that they know that now Putin is significantly weakened compared to what he was, let's say, a year and a half ago?
Right, great question. Well, Alessandra, you know what? He is weakened, but he's not defeated. So it's a dragon, which is badly wounded, but it still has fire in his mouth, and he can still fly, and he has teeth. So that's why Lloyd Austin is saying you need to weaken Russia to the extent it ceases to be a threat to. So you need to take those teeth out so they can try to bite, but they wouldn't hurt people around them. So it's still a work to be done ahead in that respect. But at the same time, you need to remember those meetings from last year, including meetings, of course, with leaders of China and India. But okay, let's forget about those for a moment. We're talking about post-Soviet space. But how these leaders of the, classical Russian client states in Central Asia were talking back to Putin. Do you remember how they were raising their voice? And using their using their wagging their finger, and saying you have to respect us, and how Putin was sitting there bedazzled and completely taken aback and by surprise, like, oh my God, why are these people talking to me like this? They used to like lick my hand and everything and ask for assistance, and they're like typical clients of mine, they used to be so afraid of me, and now they're not. So that's already a sign of changing of times. Russia is weakened already. So they are already more bold, more brave, but not to the extent to completely break their relations with Russia. Even in Armenia, for instance, people are now wondering what is this alliance, security alliance with Russia gives us in the recent few years? Probably nothing. What can we do? Of course, their security predicament is very difficult in that region. There's not too many options for them out there, open for them, but even there, they're wondering aloud now, like, what is Russia? With Kazakhstan, the same thing, basically sitting on the fence, balancing, at the same time sending a lot of assistance to Ukraine. There are these points of resilience that Kazakhs sent, including these traditional yurts, erected in Kyiv, and people get in there, and seeing it's been sent from Kazakhstan, some volunteers from there. So things are changing for him, all right? Things are changing for him. He still tries to destabilize situation here and there. In the recent few days, of course, the focus is often Moldova. Well, it's a reasonably small country, not very affluent, and so on. It's easy to destabilize it, so he's trying to destabilize it. One of the reasons, of course, he wants to distract attention of Ukrainians from some of the other parts of the front line and so on, but also to distract some of the West as well. And just to show that he can still do that, so that he still has people, agents of influence here and there. But he is limited in what he can do. He's limited in what he can do. Like today, for instance, I'm not arguing this will be done. This is for the protocol. But if Ukraine and Moldova decide that they're going to do away with Transnistria, for instance, and restore territorial integrity of Moldova, they can do it. And there's nothing Russia can do to actually stop that from happening. But again, I'm not saying that should be done. It should be done different way, of course, not by force, in different time frame, and Moldova should be calling the shots and not Ukraine. So, but that's another explanation how he is limited in what he can do. He has too much on his plate. He is absolutely overwhelmed right now. He's stretched thin. He's looking around and looking like, okay, who can else help us? Okay, North Korea will return to them. Iran will return to them, but it's not enough. For the long war that we haven't planned for, we need more resources. We need more munition and so on. And therefore, the answer is, again, like I said in the very beginning of this answer, is that he is weakened, he's bleeding profusely, we bloodied his nose together, Ukrainians plus others who helped Ukrainians, but he is not defeated. He is still resolute, he's still hopeful, he's still doubling down, he still thinks that his guts, his political intuition will get him through this. He can outweigh people because he's patient, and West is not, and Ukraine is weak. And if the Western coalition crumbles, Ukraine is on its own, so he'll take it one day sooner or later. That's his thinking. And of course, that's why it's very important, not just for the sake of Ukraine, but for a lot of other countries in the region and beyond that region, for that matter, to prove him wrong.
So let's talk a little bit about what's happening with the societies in these two countries. Volodymyr, you say that that Putin looks weak. Indeed, in Samarkand at the conference, people, even the president of Tajikistan, kept Putin waiting, which never happened before. And he seems to be indeed weakened. But the question for me is, what does he seem like in Russia, right? Given that Russian television is still completely state-controlled and very much showing him as the mighty leader. Evgenia, I would ask you, do you have a sense of how people inside Russia are considering Putin and the situation they're in? And by people here, I mean, not just sort of society at large, but also it would be interesting to know what the elite who are able to access more information are thinking about Putin right now.
Yes, Sasha, thank you. Of course, not all Russians are imperialists. We're not imperialists. Mm-hmm. It's not true. In fact, yes, it was very painful when Soviet Union fell apart because, all of us, we had friends in different parts of the former Soviet Union. But whenever people from the former Soviet Union did something great or, won some prizes, many of us, we are close relatives, I would say. And with the Ukrainians, we used to be very close relatives. Now, I think, first of all, unfortunately, we don't know what Russians think. Because as you know, response rate is 5%. Somebody, one of the sociologists here was trying to convince me that 5% it's okay. But maybe 5% it's okay in the United States, but 5% in Russia, it's not okay. Because
it's 5% response rate. Response rate,
yes, yeah. Response rate. Response rate is 5%. It is to say that 5 people out of 100 chose to answer a question from the pollsters. Usually it's a question by the phone. People are afraid. I know for sure. I have a tweet. And if when I was in Moscow and I was getting a call and was asked, who are you going, if elections tomorrow, who are you going to vote for? My answer was Alexei Navalny, of course, who else? and my sister responded, Vladimir Putin. It's not that she was in love with Vladimir Putin, but she doesn't want to have problems. She doesn't want, everybody knows that country is run by the graduates of the Soviet Union's repressive political policy, the KGB. It's not just one man, it's a corporation. And, this memory of what KGB, not even NKVD, but what KGB was doing, during the last 30 years of the Soviet regime, many people still have this memory. So people are afraid. However, it's absolutely clear that people of the age 64 and up, retirement age, they believe whatever Putin says. He's like, they probably no longer have, children who can support them. Usually it's vice versa in Russia, grandmoms, carry out families of their children, while their children, as just do nothing but drink alcohol. But the point is that for them, Putin, like Stalin was, he's their protector. He's sort of father of the nation. He's sort of big brother who is going to defend them and provide them for whatever necessities they have. Now, I can tell you, Sasha, that even so, I got this impression not out of any polls. Before I left, I was riding around the country in my car and with only one purpose: ask questions, see people, ask questions in the stores, in the markets, in some restaurants, and etc., etc., etc. Somebody was helping me to have meetings with people of different stratas. People very afraid, extremely afraid. Now, however, having said that, I do see some change among the Russian, not I would say elite, I would say among upper middle class, among those businesses who stayed in Russia. all of a sudden, when you talk to business people, they tell you that it's time, Zhenya, it's a window of opportunity again, 1,300 foreign companies left. They feel this plane, just go and grab whatever you need. You can buy, great business for $1. Everything is there. Offices are there, infrastructure, logistics is there. So some see these as time when they can make some good buck. Others, they tell you the following, Jane. You have to understand, of course, what Putin did is it's insane, Jane, it's insane. But we cannot allow them to win the war as long as it happens, because these will lead to the destruction of Russia, to its chaos, and to ideas in the heads of some radicals that Russia should be crushed, divided, etc., etc. And that means very bad for business. Sasha, you know this. You were in Russian business. That's very bad for business. And when you say, whoa, you raise hell, of course, I do. So, and you say, what are you talking about? 200,000 Russian troops dead. Okay, you couldn't kill us about Ukrainians, but 200,000 dead Russian troops, dead and wounded in the span of 1 year. Whereas, during the Afghan war, there were 15,000 plus 15,069 dead and wounded in the time period of 10 years. So, what I do? And he said, no, of course it's so bad, he's an idiot, Putin shouldn't do this. And, and these old pals around him, it's a steady key, they should go. Really, impossible, Zhenya. But money, Sasha. No. That's what I'm afraid I should tell you that, and that's what upsets me anonymously. That there are people who say, if we lose the war, then Russian Nazi or Russian right radicals like Prigozhin and Stelukov will come into power. No, we cannot allow for this to happen. This is happening precisely because they realized that this war may take years. And, they don't want to waste these years for resistance or for hard life and immigration. It's no fun to be an immigrant, right? So that's my answer to your question, the way I can.
Okay, thank you, Zhenya. Volodymyr, the situation in Ukraine is, of course, very different, right? It's incredible the way people have mobilized, both in support of Zelensky and in their willingness to go and fight on the front. We have one question, for example, about how many women have gone to join the army as volunteers of different kinds. And yet, when you see the impact of the war in Ukraine on the infrastructure, on the people, the funerals, the destroyed villages and schools and hospitals, you have to wonder, how can people go on? How are they finding the strength, and how can they continue if this lasts 2 or 3 or 4 more years? How is Ukrainian society kind of going to hold together to stay unified? I mean, so far it's amazing that they have. But could you explain, how people are thinking to themselves, where they're going to find the strength that they know they need to keep up the fight?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, obviously, you're right. Ukrainians have consolidated and offered major resistance. I think there are serious roots of resilience in Ukrainian political culture and recent history, because it's not just what we discovered in ourselves just on February 24th. You can remember about 2 Maidans, and Evgenia talked about them too, which were definitely, here I agree absolutely, 150% with her, that it was really threatening to Putin, that he was really afraid of these color revolutions and everything. he overreacted to the 2011 events in the Bolotnaya Square in Moscow, thinking that maybe it begins there as well after places like Georgia and Kyrgyzstan and Ukraine. So yeah, but at the same time, we also have a pluralistic political society. I mean, we have civil society, vibrant one. We have reformers. We almost never had someone who would have complete monopoly on power. You know, you have it in the genes, really. You don't have one clan dominating everyone else. So, and that's why it was partially that we kind of prepared for this. And of course, the war for 8 years, of course, it wasn't felt by most Ukrainians like this recent years felt now by most Ukrainians. But still, people were aware. We knew the war is ongoing. We saw pictures of people dying there. Ukrainian military actually went through this war, rotated, and now it's showing off. You know, it's really been paying off how many Ukrainian military personnel actually had experience of fighting in Donbass and now using it, unlike with the Russian military, where actually the number of people being involved was very limited. So Ukrainian society is really prepared. And of course, when you see things like Bucha, that does something to you. You know, and you did indeed have a moment where Ukrainian leadership was probably already considering some kind of negotiation, maybe some kind of concessions. You remember negotiations in Istanbul, but several things happened. First of all, we understood that Russians are not seriously negotiating. It's more like a small screen. They want to continue invasion. So, but they send a team led by who? Medinsky. Who's Medinsky? You know, I mean, to negotiate. And after all, of course, the major thing was Bucha. You know, when people discovered what happened in Bucha, we realized, oh my God, that's our destiny, that's our fate. That's what they're going to do to all of us. Doesn't matter, you know, ethnic Ukrainians, ethnic Russians, doesn't matter. Anyone who lives in Ukraine, you know, and the people in occupied lands by Russians in Ukraine, they also treated as second-class citizens. You know, they say we liberated you, but they treat you like second-class citizen. They are terrible occupiers under the national law. Occupying power actually has responsibilities before the population they occupy. But no, nothing is provided. No food, like no medical, no water, nothing. They don't care. They don't care. That's why they're ruining the cities. They say we're liberating. They're going to be part of Great Russia, New Russia, but they're ruining them. They had Kherson under their control, and they said it's a Russian city. It's not under their control. They're ruining Kherson now. Nobody cares. So nobody cares about Ukrainians. Nobody cares about Russians, like how many die. No, because it is a great ideology, great idea. But with Ukrainians, we are against the wall. I mean, it's really like nowhere else to go. I mean, some people did go, you know, to Western Europe. Some people went to Western Ukraine. Like I, for instance, I felt like I need to leave Odessa, and I spent most of last year in Western Ukraine. You know, my mother, who is 87 now, she was only twice internally displaced person in her life. First, when she was 6 at 1941, and second time now in 2022. You know, I have to give these examples for my personal, you know, family, you know, situation, because people need to understand, if they listen to us Ukrainians, it's not like some ideological crazy fight that we're waging and we don't know what for. We know what for. It's about existence. It's really about surviving. So that's why people are really, you know, consolidating and ready to endure this test. If someone in Kremlin came up with this idea, let's launch missiles and drones into energy infrastructure and power stations in Ukraine, because that would create a stir, an uproar in Ukraine. Ukrainians would go into streets and demand Zelensky to sign a peace treaty with Kremlin. You know, it's unbelievable if someone can believe in this BS. And it shows how Russians actually, why would they care about Ukraine and controlling Ukraine, how they never actually give themselves a job to actually study what's going on with those Ukrainians. Who are they? What do they believe? You know, what those Ukrainians are all about? Never. You know, so therefore, of course, they have been trying, but in vain, to find a breaking point. They haven't found one. Is there one ahead of us? I don't know. But so far, they haven't found one. And I'm not seeing any. And Ukrainians are basically in a situation like, well, what can we do? What's the alternative? We cannot surrender. Surrender would be even worse, because we see what happens to Ukrainians under Russian occupation. So how can we surrender? And how can we actually, in a good mind and clear mind, doom millions of Ukrainians to continue living in those occupied lands? Because therefore, we need to try to do whatever we can to liberate those lands.
So this is one of the mysteries to me, Zhenya. I hope you can answer it for me, right? Which is that Russians and Ukrainians were quite close for a long time, and yet it appears that the Russian leadership, at least, completely misunderstood what had happened in Ukrainian society since 2014 and the annexation of Crimea. And this unification of society, this change from being quite divided between East and West, between pro-Russian and pro-Western, and the idea that they were going to cruise into Kiev and in 3 days have a parade because they were met with bread and salt was completely delusional. So we've been trying to figure out, why is it that the Russians were so poorly informed about the situation on the ground in Kiev? And I think the Financial Times had a piece yesterday or the day before saying, well, Medvedchuk was the person who was giving advice to Putin and he had no idea what was going on. And also the people that they were paying on the street as informers turned out to be just taking the money and not actually giving information. Do you think that's true? Does that explain why the Russians had so little understanding about Ukraine?
No, I think it is just one side to the story, one minor piece. First of all, it's a known problem, as you're well aware in political science, that dictator choosing between loyalty and expertise chooses loyalty. That's Dictators and Visas, excellent paper written by Guriev, Yegorov, and Sonin back in the second Putin's term, precisely about that. So therefore, dictators, they prefer to listen to the kind of information that pleases them. And if they don't like the messenger, then under Stalin, the messenger was killed, or a messenger was killed. And under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, they went to Gulag, right? So to Perm 36, the famous political zone. So that's number one, that the kind of expertise that they have is extremely bad. Secondly, time and again, all of us will listen to Mr. Patrushev. Mr. Patrushev is your Fiona Hill, is your Sullivan, is your, Brzezinski, and at times when they were national security advisors to American presidents.
I don't think Fiona is going to like that comparison. I'm going to tell you right now.
No, I mean not weight, because obviously Patrushev has a bigger weight with respect to Putin than, but, in terms of the kind of services they're supposed to provide to their bosses. So, and Patrushev was one of those ideologues who believed that the whole goal of existence of the United States was and is to grab Russian resources. The United States cannot wake up in the morning and not to think how to grab Russian Siberia. And he stated this time and again, and he pointed to some never happened interview by Madeleine Albright, as you remember, this anecdote. So it is to say that when you stay in power for 22 years, you lose touch. Yeah. You no longer understand what's really happening. And the kind of information and the quality of expertise is extremely low. Putin believes that the world is run the way it is run in Russia. If he believes in anything, he believes in the US dollar. He believes in the power of the US dollar. And that's why former Prime Minister of France, former President of Finland, former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Austria, former Chancellor of Germany, and so it goes. Should I name each and every lord and member of the Commons and etc. in Great Britain? Probably you don't want me to present you with the entire list, even though I ask, I can. So it is to say that Putin was extremely successful in appealing to the lowest of lows in the human nature. And he saw that those Germans or those British, with all their many 100 years of democracy or many years of hierarchy, or you name it, they're all the same. When he was coming to them and saying, Mr. Former Chancellor, or Mr. Prime Minister, would you want to sit on the board of Rosneft, Surgutneftegas, you name it, Gazprom, and etc., and receive $264,000 a month? or more? And the answer was, Mr. Putin. Of course. So I'm sorry to tell you, but yes, thanks God, we don't know American politicians or former statesmen who, at least there are some, directors, some personalities in Hollywood who were as easily bribed. We're not going to name. Well, should I name them? Just let me know.
Okay. We all know anyway. Yeah.
Yes, Oliver Stone for one.
Yeah.
So anyway,
wait, Volodymyr has a two finger for that.
2 fingers, yes.
Yeah.
How about the director of FBI New York office who became errand boy for Deripaska? We just discovered that. So I'm not sure it's not reaching into.
No. Listen, that's lobbyists. That's lobbyists and lawyers. They're easily bought anywhere in the world.
He was tasked to work on Deripaska, basically to recruit him, and instead Deripaska recruited him. So
yes, I read, of course. I read the story
within American law enforcement. Yeah.
No, you're right. I'm just saying that no, we're talking about statesmen. FBI, it's not about statesmanship. It's about service, counterintelligence operations. So it's a little bit. But anyway,
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
It is to say that Putin got a lot of proof.
He did.
That everyone can be bought. Now, with Ukraine, from what I was told when I was in Moscow, yes, they were aware that Ukrainian SBU, which was before that part of the KGB, they were pals at arms. They served with some of them, and they believed that they managed quite successfully to buy out a lot of people from the Ukrainian Secret Service. And we do know that they succeeded. That's why Zelensky at some point fired the head of the SBU and fired quite a few generals from there. We also know that the reason Russians managed to occupy Kherson, and by the way, it was the only city that they managed to occupy. Mariupol, of course, they just destroyed, turned into dust. Guernica. But the only reason that they managed to occupy Kherson was because they bought out the head of the SBU of Kherson. The SBU is Security Service of Ukraine, which was basically KGB in the Soviet Union, right? So they managed to recruit SBU people in Kherson, and they gave the order, and that's why, there was no really resistance. So Putin, he's a very experienced guy. Don't take him, don't think that he has his view of the world. That view of the world destroyed two countries, Ukraine and Russia. It's not just, he conducting the war, this awful war in Ukraine, and at the same time he's destroying Russia as a state, and Russia will, at least Ukrainians. When I was trying to get to Ukraine over the New Year, my idea was, Sasha, I wanted to write a story that Ukrainians, they have hope. Life is awful, no heat, no water, bombs. People killed around en masse, but they do have hope. We don't. I don't know when I will be able to return back home. And I'm no longer a young girl, right? And I do like my apartment, my bed, and my books. Sasha, I have quite a few books there. So it is an awful tragedy that unveiling as we speak. Unfortunately, it's still tragedy in making.
So Volodymyr, let's talk a little bit about Zelensky, right? You of course, have hinted at the fact that there have been, well, and Evgenia said it also, that there have been firings recently at different levels. Some of it seems to be for corruption, some of it for disloyalty. But at this point, there seems to be quite a lot of unity around Zelensky and this understanding that, you don't criticize the president when you're at war, right? Especially a president who's doing an amazing job. But do you think that creates its own risks, that Zelensky is kind of also in a sort of echo chamber where people are telling him things that are positive? Is there a chance that he kind of loses his feeling for what is really happening in Ukraine?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first of all, on Kherson, yes, I'm glad that Evgenia mentioned that. I think it was more than one SBU guy or just a bunch of guys. I think it was quite a lot of people who were actually infiltrated or bought or both, and that's how they got so quickly to Kherson. How that happened, that the bridge in Chongar was demined by Ukrainian troops just on the eve of their invasion, and that's the only bridge basically which is connecting Crimea with the rest of Ukraine. So if you just blow it up, that would not stop Russian invasion in the south from Crimea, but it would delay it substantially and give available precious time to Ukrainian military to maybe maneuver a little bit and get better ready for the incoming Russian troops. So there are questions there. As you say, Sasha, of course, it's quite true that we have decided that we're going to talk about all this after the war. But then when it's going to be after the war, we don't know yet. And yeah, there is a logic. There is a position there. People who hate Zelensky and Zelensky hates them, but they're kind of quiet and silent. They're not Timoshenko, Poroshenko. They're not really making much of criticism of Zelensky. That's understandable, but he's done a good job indeed since the start of the war as a communicator. And, has been mentioned already before. He's an excellent communicator. Well, he's a professional actor. I think he was the right man for the right moment. That's exactly who you need. You need to communicate. You need to lobby. You need to sense your opponent, counterpart rather, when you're conversing with someone. When he talks to someone in the West, it's really very hard to say no to him when he's asking for something like financial assistance or weapons, something like that. So yeah, he's done a great job, and that's reflected in his ratings. Internationally, rock star, within Ukraine, also high ratings. That's for the guy who on February 23rd had his ratings in upper 20s, So, but that's he's skyrocketed. But that there is a problem. There's those dilemmas and traps for him. First of all, if he has to preside over some compromise with Russia, and maybe doing some concessions, and maybe agreeing to at least temporarily leaving some Ukrainian lands under Russian control, that will be a perilous moment for him politically, because his rating will go down. The position would then not be silent. There is a civil society, there is a government, there is parliament, there is opposition, there is military, which might have the question like why we've lost so many of our brothers, and now we're actually not trying to liberate some land. And another thing is what you say, yes, you can be feeling quite comfortable when you have this powerful prerogatives and powers in your hands that none of Ukrainian presidents did have before the war, because it's martial law, because you're now all powerful, you're almighty, you have all this levers that no one ever had before, including, by the way, de-oligarchization, which a lot of people here in the West demanded from Ukraine, and now Zelensky kind of doing it. And what I'm hearing here is people say, this extra legal ways of dealing with this is not okay with us. But what do you think? Maybe just to undercut their influence in political, economic life of Ukraine, you can't stay exclusively within purely legal field. You can actually use whatever levers you can do. Not to mention that, of course, they will be weakened, subjectively speaking, by losing a lot of property because of the war. So they're much poorer now than they were before the war. So that's already, by definition, by default, is cutting some of their influence within Ukrainian society. So Ukrainian political society remains vibrant. Zelensky is not a god, is not a tsar, not a king. He's not living in a vacuum like Putin does, sitting there on a cloud and making decisions, and no one else intervenes.
He's just a great guy.
Yeah, right. Yeah, well, rain cloud. Okay. Yeah, but so Zelensky has to deal with all these other elements, because Ukrainian political society, even during the war, is much more competitive, much more open, much more transparent, democratic political system. We can talk about some threats, like another thing, for instance, like that Ukraine would probably draw a lesson that to be better prepared for future aggressions or continuation of that ongoing aggression, Ukraine should be paying more attention to military preparedness, which would probably push us towards becoming some kind of a militaristic camp. If that becomes true, and that might have to be done, that means that maybe it would be detrimental to democracy and curtailing some rights. and definitely really bad for, funding things like healthcare or education or anything like that, when you would have to spend almost all your earnings on military. But yeah, that's how it is. So there are dangers ahead. It's a rocky path. Even if you imagine the war is over tomorrow, then still Ukraine has so much to do. I mean, you need to return all those people who left. You need to recover and rebuild all this, all this economy which is now in ruins. There's so much to do, and maintain the democratic character along the way.
Mm-hmm. So if Zelensky is trying to carry out this de-oligarchization, as Volodymyr coins a sketchy word, I'm wondering, Zhenya, do you think we're seeing some of that in Russia as well? Kind of this shift to a more to a Kremlin where military figures are much more important, and the business people, the sort of Sechins and the half government officials, half oligarchs who had risen under Putin, being more marginalized, and does it even matter?
I think this process started quite some time ago. Mm-hmm. Russia doesn't have oligarchs anymore. Oligarchs in the pure, in this political science world, when we mean businessmen, business people who have amassed great wealth, and who are using this wealth for political ends, trying to influence decisions and appoint their own heads of agencies, governors, and presidents. In that respect, Russia no longer have the oligarchs. But some of them, they were buying their way through, and they still do this. Now it's the question of survival for many of them. So a lot of businesses will find their way in the hands of Putin's so-called new oligarchs. Now, you can say that Putin is surrounded by military. No, he's surrounded by the KGB man. Kovalchuki, Yuri Kovalchuk, he's a businessman, right? He's also the former officer of the third main directorate. Igor Sechin, allegedly, okay, I'm saying this, please put allegedly. Igor Sechin, he's the chairman of the board of Rosneft. He's also the former officer of the third main directorate and the department of group, military intelligence.
Can you explain what the third directorate is, in case someone doesn't know?
Department, we can say. Third directorate, it was the directorate inside the KGB, which was responsible for counterintelligence in the military. It was in charge of surveillance over Russian vast military-industrial complex, whether it's army, chief of staff, or Minister of Defense, or troops all across the country. So it goes. So in that respect, I don't see change. I think that this question, what's going to happen in Ukraine, is extremely interesting, because, for instance, we know that as one of the outcomes of the World War II was that a lot of generals came into power in different countries, starting with the United States. Dwight Eisenhower, right? Or then, later on, de Gaulle in France. And it's understandable. And it also presents certain danger, because we already know that, there is some tension, or, alleged tension between the chief of the commander-in-chief. Zelensky's commander-in-chief or not? Yes, he's also commander-in-chief. But, between Mr. Zaluzhny, General Zaluzhny, who is the head of the Ukrainian military, and some civilians on Bankovo. So, and it's unavoidable. And therefore, but we're looking far ahead of us. Right now, we're in the process when it's important for Ukraine to get as much weapons as possible, to have enough tanks and enough F-16, please, F-16, to win this war. Because there is no alternative. Because it's not just the war for the survival of Ukraine, even though it is, but it's also the war for the survival of Europe as a liberal continent, Europe as European Union of parliamentary republics, union which manifests these liberal values, freedom values, and etc. So this is also important, but also it's important because Putin will never stop. He cannot. If you look at the trajectory of his trajectory, what did he do during these last 22 years? You would agree with my point that starting a war against Ukraine, or I can imagine that it could be a war against Kazakhstan as well. But starting the war against Ukraine was absolutely logical step for him. In fact, my sources in Moscow told me, those people who did see Putin prior to the war, in the last days prior to the war, they told me that Putin was thinking about expanding his military campaign back in 2014 when the war started, in fact. It was sort of, not so noticeable for the entire world that already Russia and Ukraine were at war, and Russia already invaded and occupied eastern Ukraine. And there were some people who argued that and advised Putin to expand the war further to the west and to at least to the south. And he decided not to do that after annexation of Crimea, when he saw that annexation of Crimea brought him 88% rating. And he decided, no, let's be reasonable. All of a sudden, he felt himself a Jew. Let's be reasonable, let's not, use all our goods at once. And therefore, he decided that, his next step, he will undertake close to his 2024. You can say it elections, but something like that. And, he knew that he was going to be in bad need of pumping up ratings. So, and that's, of course, that was, he tried to calculate that. And obviously we see that he miscalculated everything.
Okay, Volodymyr, let's talk about the annexation of Crimea, right? So right now, many people look back and say, not only did it bring Putin what he wanted, which was increased popularity at a time when it had been going down, but it also produced rather less backlash in the Western countries than the Russian state had anticipated, right? So yes, there were some sanctions, right? There was some noise. And then in 2015, Nord Stream 2 agreement was signed, and the Russians managed to use import substitution and get around the sanctions that had been imposed. And so the takeaway seems to have been that, yes, we took part of Ukraine, and the West shouted and then forgot about it and moved on and wasn't willing to cut off their access to Russian oil and gas. So what is it that you think could have been done differently after 2014? Obviously, that was a big turning point in Ukrainian society in terms of getting people to mobilize, training volunteer and territorial defense units, getting a lot more training on equipment. But that really seems to have been a missed opportunity in the West to respond and show Russia that that was unacceptable. Were there opportunities that were missed in Ukraine to respond to that in a stronger way that might have better prepared the country for what came next?
Yeah, well, Sasha, with a question like this, we can do another hour. But yeah, if you're West, you can definitely say that there were wrong signals and wrong reactions. And to do that, you would have to go back to what Evgeny has mentioned, 2008 in Georgia. What does Putin see as a response from the West? NATO needing northern distribution route into Afghanistan, working with Russia, new Obama administration announcing reset, that kind of signal. Putin said, okay, fine. Well, they're actually turning blind eye. Not only that, but they are offering us more cooperation, right on the heels of our aggression into Georgia. And then some people said, okay, well, that's Georgia. They wouldn't do it to Ukraine. Ukraine is too big and so on. And then 2014 happened. And then people said, okay, it's just Crimea and Donbass. It's very small, minor incursion, so there will be no massive war. We see what's happening now. So that's actually, I think it's a teaching moment for all those people who now might say, okay, but he would never do that or this or that. never say never. So I think for the West, been a lot of wrong signals. Like in the 2014 after Crimea, the sanctions were really mild. Actually, the stronger sanctions were implemented after Malaysian airliner was downed, and that's by itself, by the way, quite a telling moment for us Ukrainians. Like, well, when Russians took away Crimea and started messing with Donbass, that's not reason strong enough for serious sanctions. But when an airplane full of mostly Western people, Dutch, Australians, being shot down of Ukrainian sky, oh, that's a serious offense that really warrants serious sanctions. So and so on, and maybe a Syria situation when Obama said there are red lines, and then Assad crossed red lines, and then Obama said, okay, we're actually probably not going to do anything about it. So I think there've been many of those signals that really embolden Putin. In terms of Ukraine, yes, we haven't wasted completely the time, this 8 years, because after all, like I said, there was some reform in the army. Some people gained valuable experience in Donbass. Some people made draw lessons from Ilovaisk and Debaltsevo and how not to repeat this tragedies for Ukrainian military. There was a lot of training with the West. There's a lot of cooperation with NATO. Actually, one of the reasons I believe in the long list of things that pushed Putin across tipped him across this red line to actually greenlight the invasion was that he was seeing that Ukraine is slowly but surely slipping away, really involving more and more itself with the West. I'm really disappointed with Zelensky because he was obviously happy when Zelensky was elected in 2019, but then he clearly discovered, oh my God, this guy is probably even worse than Poroshenko. We couldn't really do anything with Minsk agreements or anything with him. So, and Ukrainians work with NATO. We got some of those trainings that a lot of people now credit for how Ukrainian military is fighting, definitely in the first weeks and months of the war, how this fighting tactical smartness and creativeness of Ukrainian military distinguishes itself from this rigid vertical power in the Russian military, when unless the general on the very top gives you a command, you don't know what to do. In Ukrainian military in that time already would be doing some decisions on the spot by some kind of mid-rank officer. So that was some of the examples of what actually was done in Ukraine, and the civil society understood already we have a war. Okay, not of the scale that we have for the last year, but still a war in our hands. So we have to be paying attention to this wartime effort. And the military has been supplied with a lot of things that they needed initially, because we didn't have any forces back in 2014. One of the ministers of defense there spoke to Verkhovna Rada, our parliament, and he said we probably have 5,000 to 7,000 combat-ready troops, with a general number of people in the military, something like 130,000. So that was a result of the previous years. A lot of people were hoping that Budapest Memorandum is somehow guarding our security. A very naive belief. Most experts like myself was that for many years. Forget about it. Turn that page. That paper has been signed already, but it's irrelevant. Basically, Ukraine is not defended, it's not protected, it's not secure. So now actually we have to think really hard about what you're going to do about Ukraine's security long term, like what it should be. Another Budapest Memorandum, not going to cut it. Should it be some cooperation with NATO all the way, and not forgetting about membership maybe at some point in the future? Should it be guarantees from some particular countries? Should be something else? Should be a combination of those options? But those 8 years were not completely wasted. But of course, Ukraine should have done more to prepare itself for this massive Russian invasion.
So we're running out of time, but I want to ask each of you one last question, which is, what is it that you think that people in the West, in Europe and in the United States don't understand about the conflict, that it's imperative that they understand in order to act appropriately for the situation? Let me start with you, Zhenya, and then Volodymyr, I'll let you have the last word.
I don't know all people in the West, so I cannot say what when people in the West don't understand. But I see that some of American experts, at least those who write for the Foreign Affairs, which I read, they don't understand that Putin cannot allow himself to stop. The minute he stops invading other countries, he's dead. He's alive until he's capable to conduct a war. And so whoever is going to substitute him will do the first step of this next Russian whoever is going to be to stop the war. And it is to say that if Putin gets a success in Ukraine, he will go to Poland, he will go to Moldova. He will keep going regardless of how many, he couldn't care less how many Russian souls will be wasted on the battlefields. So to cut a long story short, I think that some in the West fail to recognize that Ukrainians are protecting the entire world from these another. I hate to make any comparisons with Nazi Germany, but it is existential war not just for Ukraine and not just for Russia. I think it is an existential war for the entire Europe. If Europe wants to be a free and liberal union, then they have no other choice. Europe has no other choice but to stop Putin.
But in your opinion, this is a Putin problem, not a Russia problem.
I don't understand when you say Russia.
I mean, if
I
Putin,
am Russia, my daughter is Russia.
Right, I'm not saying Russians, right? But what you're suggesting is that Putin is the core of the problem. And if he were removed, the next person who comes to power, whoever that is going to not have the same mindset, the same imperial mindset about this, what they consider their sphere of influence, that it is just Putin who is leading the Russians or the Russian state to war right now.
For sure, it's not just Putin. And probably there are people around here. We know for sure that Yuri Kovalchuk is of the same, sort of same kind. However, I would say that whoever is going to come after Putin, he does understand. And Putin will go if he loses the war. Then he will understand that the first step to get rid at least of some sanctions, this first step is to stop the war, start paying reparations to Ukraine, and do this. So they will have just no alternative. Now, is it to say that whoever who is going to come after Putin is going to be a great liberal guy? No, we need to liberate Navalny from prison. Then we will elect him as a president. Then he dissolves presidency, and Russia will become a parliamentary type of republic.
All right, so it's good we let Zhenya finish on her optimistic note. Volodymyr, let me ask you also what you think people don't understand. And let me also say there's a question here that maybe you can address, which is, besides gathering social media awareness and giving donations, what can ordinary citizens do to help Ukraine?
Well, I'll start with that question then. I mean, first of all, what's been mentioned, that's already a lot. Giving donations, paying attention, keeping the war on the radar, it's not over, shouldn't be forgotten. Not allow a new news cycle to push Ukrainian situation and the war that Russia is waging on Ukraine away from your attention cycle. So that's already a lot. Demand your congressman to be paying attention. Continue support for the Ukraine because it's a democratic country, United States. So if you make your opinion known to your elected officials, they would have to reflect on this. So, and in terms of what the West is doing wrong or maybe doesn't understand, I think they actually learned a lot in the last year. There have been a lot of situations when you have to say it's been a wake-up call. It's been really serious understanding of what it's all about, what Russia is capable of, what kind of threat are we dealing with. It's a mortal threat, So does that mean that the West is ready for some kind of a new Cold War, systemic, protracted confrontation like it was in the second half of 20th century? I'm not sure about that. Maybe not. But at least there is this understanding that, well, it's not just one type of event, one example of misbehavior. It's actually much deeper than that. And we need to keep the unity. And the idea of unity of the West is something which has really resulted out of this war. And of course, American leadership is there too. I mean, we haven't seen anything similar to this type of American leadership like we've seen in the last year. even in the months prior to February 24th already. So that we now have a lesson on this subject, like, is American leadership possible in today's world, and is it needed? And the answer to both those questions is yes, absolutely possible and needed, and that's what Biden administration is providing. We might be sometimes impatient in Ukraine and critical how it's delayed some assistance and some of those weapons, how long it takes for them to arrive to Ukraine. But in general, I mean, he's been really doing a good job in terms of this war. And therefore, I think there's not much to be educated. If you're someone in the West, if you pay attention, you notice what's going on. I mean, if you're deliberately naive, or you have this distorted point of view of what's going on, then of course you can blame NATO and US and Ukrainians and imperialism and whoever. I mean, instead of actually looking at who actually started that war. And by the way, I agree absolutely with Evgeny. I think if Putin out of the picture, this war will end. You know, whoever comes in his place, there will be changes. There will be so much, first of all, some volatility in Russian political system if Putin is out of power, that it would be completely impossible for them to continue waging that systemic big war.
All right, thank you both, Evgenia Albats and Volodymyr Dubovik. Thank you so much for participating in the discussion, for commemorating the 1 year of this tragic war together with us and really trying to understand what's going on. And I look forward to being able